So, you had homework due last night, right? And I think there was some confusion on the homework that was supposed to prepare you for Chapter 2. The study that said that reading diet articles, girls who read diet articles end up with a higher rate of eating disorders than girls who don't. How many people got a little bit confused about what was going on in that study and identifying what the possible confounders were as opposed to the causal links and so forth? Raise your hand. How many people was it crystal clear for? Well, there's some, I guess there's a lot of people in between. Well, we're going to spend a lot of time we'll go over that particular problem and other problems like it. And I think after this lecture, you'll be more clear on that. Now, where did we leave off? In this section, we left off after, let's see what we did. I remember we highlighted a lot on page 3, right? Wasn't that where we left off in this class? Now let's just zoom way in here so you can see what's going on. And let's make sure the lighting is good for the camera back there. And first of all, you need to unmute the camera, Ellen. Okay, now, is that good for the filming or should I adjust it? Let me see. Does that look right? It has some, I think that's okay, right?
Try adjusting it a little bit. Maybe a little.
Zoom in a little bit. Is that better?
That's good.
That's good. Okay. So, all right. So we left off there looking at the two main reasons why randomization is key. Number one, it eliminates human bias. We want the two groups, the treatment and control group, to be as alike as possible on all characteristics, not just those that we match them up on, those that we might not even be aware of. We want no subjective bias, either conscious bias or unconscious bias, to enter in. Why? Because then we're going to have these two groups that are as alike as possible within random variation, as like as possible, with no systematic differences, and then at that point, we give the treatment, whatever that treatment is, to the group. It could be a drug, it could be an educational method, whatever we're trying to figure out, if it works or not, we give the treatment to one of the groups and not to the others. So that's the only systematic difference between the two groups. So then time passes, and when we get to the end of the experiment, and we look at the responses, let's say it was a drug, we look at the health status of the two groups, and if the group that got the drug has better health status, improved or got cured at a higher rate, whatever the drug was meant to do, well, then we say, it had to be the drug, the treatment that's causing that improvement, that difference we see. Why? Because everything else was the same. Not exactly the same. That brings us to point 2. Not exactly the same, but the same within random variation. Remember that there are two different groups, we randomly assign them. So there's going to be some random, accidental differences just due to the flip of the coin. Now, since we did a random assignment, we can measure the likely size of those differences and see if the differences that we got when we included the treatment are beyond what we would expect just through chance variation. If they're well enough beyond, very unlikely to see just by chance variation, the chance that we would get such an extreme difference, such a healthier group, that the group who got the drug would have improved so much in their health status. The chance that we would see that just because of random variations, if it really didn't work at all, is if it gets that chance, which is called a p-value, is extremely small, then we conclude, we reject that idea that the pill was just a dull null. We call it the null hypothesis, that the drug was just a dud. And we say it worked. So that's the idea. Those two things are very important. That's the main idea, that's the central idea of this experimental design. And now we're going to look at what happens, what types of biases we see when experiments are not randomly designed. And some experiments cannot be. Some experiments just can't be, and that's next chapter, observational studies. Studies that are harmful to you, like studies on smoking can't be, or just things that happen can't be. And then how, we can't, then it becomes more like a mystery. We have to solve what is going on here. You know, we see this effect, we observe this effect, and is it real or not? Or is there some other culprit that's really, some other cause that's really causing it? So it's more like like with the reading diet articles, that example. It becomes like a mystery game, and it's more of an art than a science, and it's really complicated to tease out what exactly is going on in these experiments. And so we're going to spend some time thinking about it, because it's extraordinarily important and very, it's hard to do. So we need to do it as a class. You guys got to help me out with this too. All right. So I think that was this page. We said that in keeping with making the two groups as alike as possible, we certainly want to treat them alike. So once you randomly assign them to treatment or control group, you want to treat them exactly the same. So if you give one a drug, you want to give one something that looks like a drug, a placebo. You want to treat them exactly the same, as much as possible. If you have somebody evaluating the responses, you don't want them to know who's in which group. We don't want to let any of our subjective biases play into the picture. We want to keep this as scientific and as objective as possible, with the goal being, the only difference being, one group got the drug and the other didn't. So no other differences could confuse our results. If we introduce other differences, like we don't give a placebo, well then, one group knows they got the drug. Maybe it's just a psychological idea that they know they got the drug that's causing the improvement. Maybe, or it's adding to it. Or maybe the evaluators knew who was in which group and are therefore much more curious in doing it, asking them more questions. They're curious about this. They're not treating them exactly the same. So that's our ideal experiment, and it's right down here. It's the randomized, let's look down here. So our basic method right here, this is the ideal. What they call the gold standard. I'm sure you've heard that now. The gold standard of experimental design is a randomized, controlled. What does that mean? It means that the experimenter controls who goes into the treatment group and who goes into the comparison group. And then it's double blind. Neither the subjects themselves nor the evaluator knows who is in which group. That's what we're aiming for. Of course, it's not always possible. So now, when we turn the page, we have this example that beautifully illustrates all the concepts that we talked about, and it's a very important experiment. It's the an experiment that was done to see if the polio vaccine, way back in 1954, an experiment was done, one of the largest field trials ever conducted in the world, and it was fascinating because there were two large trials, one done randomly and one done non-randomly. And it's very interesting to look at the results, particularly because the non-random one ended up of course, being biased, but usually we think that whenever we have a non-random assignment, when the doctors themselves choose, or when we somehow in some other way choose, that we end up biasing the treatment. That generally happens. This was a very unusual study because the non-random study was certainly biased, but the bias was in the opposite direction. It masked the true effectiveness of the disease, of the vaccine. In other words, it looked like it worked. But it masked how much it really worked. So it's unusual, but I think we do not have the time to do this one, unfortunately. This is the first time I've skipped it, but I'm much more happy that we're going slower and that I'm getting some class participation, which I think that is really the only way this is going to sink in, is if we can work together more, and that takes time, and I think you'll learn it better. So for this time, for this semester, we are going to skip this example. So let's just, even though it's one of my favorite, skip this example, and so it's pages 4 through 7. It doesn't introduce any new concepts, it's just a really cool illustration, an in-depth illustration of what we've talked about, but we're going to look at some other examples instead. So we're going to skip this, and we're going to go straight to page 4, 5, and 6. We're skipping page, not 7, we're starting at 7, so let's just say 4, 5, skip page 4 through 6. All right, so we're going to start on page 7. Okay. All right, so now these actually, page 7, are examples of medical studies that have either no controls, kind of like how I've talked about how I've experimented with the notebook here, no explicit comparison group, no actual quantitative comparison between using the notebook as a teaching method and not. Okay, even though I've made a lot of implicit comparisons in my head, I still consider it an experiment, but it's an uncontrolled one. So we're going to look at medical studies that have no controls, historical controls, and other forms of non-randomized controls, where they've actually collected data and made comparisons, and show how they are usually biased toward the treatment. That's why the polio vaccine was so unusual, and I wanted to present it, but we just don't have time, because it was a bias that just went the other way. Okay, so now let's start with, this is an interesting series of studies. There were those of you who are entering the health field in any capacity. I'm curious, how many people are interested in pursuing some kind of career in health? Raise your hands. That's a lot of you. And statistics is just so important in that field. I can't stress enough how decisions, some decisions, many decisions, almost most decisions can only be made statistically in that field. So it's extremely important. So, and it's sort of a new thing. As I told you, I think in this class, that back in the day, you know, doctors didn't need that. They just needed, you know, just anecdotal evidence, stories, guided them along the way. And where our brains are so much more suited to do that. Now we need to learn statistics because the data is available to us and we can't neglect it. We can't just turn it aside. We can do so much more because we have the data. All right, so let's look at what's these mistakes that have been made in the past. All right, so here is a study. Actually, it's a meta-analysis. It's a study of other studies. So there were 51 studies done on this procedure called, it's an operation, a very serious operation, to insert a portacavale shunt into, to redirect the flow of blood in patients who would otherwise are very high risk for hemorrhaging. They have cirrhosis of the liver, and they could easily bleed to death. And these are patients who are at high risk for not surviving the next few years. And so the doctors certainly want to help these patients do something, and they think this makes sense. Instead of just having, hemorrhaging is horrible, they're going to die. So instead, why don't we insert this shunt in where we have control over the blood, and we can, so that we can help them survive. Okay. The operation itself also is extremely risky to do. It's a very major operation. All right, so 51 studies were done, each with many patients. Now let's look at this. There's some of the studies, no controls, some had non-randomized controls, and some had randomized controls. Let's start with the no controls, the way I'm doing my notebook, okay? Now, how many were there? There were a total of 24 plus 7 plus 1, that's 32. And 24 of them I labeled markedly enthusiastic. That meant, these are all published studies, and it meant that these studies said, yes, I'm enthusiastically advocating you in your practice to do this. I believe it's a very successful operation that will extend the lives of patients in this condition and work much better than what I did in the past, but they didn't give any explicit quantitative comparisons. They didn't collect data from the previous semester, from the previous patients, or have a control group that they didn't do it, that they didn't assign people to control and then make a comparison. Okay, 7 of them were moderately enthusiastic and only 1 said, no, don't do this. Okay, now, so that's 75%. Now let's look at these non-randomized controls. Only 15 of these studies were done, but still 10 out of the 15 were very enthusiastic and said that they got excellent results. Now, they made an explicit comparison, and they said the people that we operated on survived longer. So I strongly recommend that you do this. And then there were only 4 studies, because these randomized ones are harder to do, only 4 studies that were randomized, and none of them advocated using this procedure. One of them was sort of somewhat on the fence, but the others just said, no, this isn't good, this doesn't work. So we get dramatically different results. So, why do you think the people who use no controls were the most enthusiastic about the surgery? Do you have any, just shoot out some ideas about human nature. Why do you think these doctors might be most enthusiastic? Does anybody have any idea why that would be? Yes? Yeah, what she said is probably because they wanted it to work. If you want something to work and you're not actually presented with hard evidence, you might see positive results where there really aren't any, right? I mean, don't you think we could all be guilty of that? These doctors want to help their patients. They want them. And the patients probably do better. They do, you operate on people you want them to do better. And then who are they comparing them to? In their mind, they're probably comparing them to all the patients in the past who did poorly. That's probably what sticks in their mind. All the patients that died that they wish they could have saved. And they might not be making a fair comparison. Does that make sense to people? So let's write that down. I think it's just a doctor bias, and it's not necessarily it's just human nature. Okay, so we can just say exactly what you said. Doctors want. Who wants their patients to die on the operating? Who wants their patients to die? The doctors want to help their patients, want the operation to succeed. So when they're not confronted with hard evidence, a hard quantitative comparison, so without you know, hard, what I mean by hard is numbers, hard data in front of them, without the hard data, they might see more positive results than really exist. I think it's very easy for us to understand this. Okay, so that explains them. Now, in order to answer this question, the non-randomized studies were much more enthusiastic than the non-randomized studies. What are some possible explanations for that? Let me just present you with it. Let's pretend we're engaged in this experiment, because I think it will just become much more apparent if you see, if you actually see how it would happen. So let's pretend I'm a doctor who's considering doing this porticavale shunt, and you all are patients with serious cirrhosis of the liver who've come to me, and I have to decide which ones of you I'm going to help. And I want to help you all. But I look around and I think, I want to choose those patients that could most benefit from this surgery. Not all of you are strong enough to survive the operation. You know, I look around and I say, oh, I would hate to lose you on the operating table. You know, we formed such a good relationship. Oh, I just don't want to. You have a few good years left. I could do other stuff, but I'm just not sure you're going to make it. That's what I would say. I wouldn't tell you that. And then I would look over here and I would say maybe, I think you can make it. I think you've got the sturdiness. I think I can really, I'm going to try with you. I think we can do something here, and so forth. You know, I'm just picking out people randomly here. So wouldn't you do that if you were a doctor? Wouldn't you think, look over each patient as an individual and think who could most benefit from this? Wouldn't you? Certainly some of these people are so frail. Some of the people are really going to die within a few weeks, and you would never. I mean, I think it would be immoral to put them on the operator table, cut them all up, make them suffer all that when you know they're going to die in a month anyways. So those are completely out, those patients. And then you still want to make sure that these people are strong enough, that they have the family support, that they really want to do it. They're going to really give it their all. Okay, so let's say I went through each and every one of you, and I did that. And I divided you up into two groups. And this group right here was the group that I decided I was going to go ahead and perform this serious operation on. And you guys over here, as much as I care about you, I probably wouldn't have even told you about the operation, you know, because I don't want to make you think you're missing out on something. I would just continue giving you the best care that I can, and same with you guys. All right? So, and then I would wait 3 years, that's what we do, and look at the results. And look what happened when we do that. This is really what happened. These were the results in the non-randomized, right here. The 3-year survival rate. Let's not look at those yet. Just focus on these. That middle group, you guys, had a 60% survival rate. And the two sides, you guys, who I didn't operate on, the controls, had only a 45% survival rate. Most of you died after 3 years. So I'm very enthusiastic when I look at these numbers. 60% chance of survival versus 45. And I write, this is the procedure to use. It works so well. Okay? Do you see? Now, what's wrong with that? How did they, what did these doctors do? These doctors chose, non-randomly, doctors chose non-randomly, but in the best interest of the patient, as an individual, the doctors chose non-randomly in the best interest. They did what they thought they were doing right, in the best interest of the patients. And they chose to either put them in the treatment group, in which case, in this case, we call the treatment what? Surgery? Isn't it surgery? Right? Isn't the treatment group getting the operation? Okay, so the treatment group is the surgery group. That says surgery. And the control group, which I'm going to call the comparison group, it's just less confusing. And in the comparison group, who did they put? They just put, what did they choose to do? They didn't operate. No surgery, no operation. All right, that's what they did. Now, the problem is, are there differences between these two groups? They weren't randomly chosen. If they were randomly chosen, these groups would be exactly alike. If they were randomly chosen, let's just think about it for a minute. If they were randomly chosen, this is, let's say this is what I'm about to do, and then another doctor comes in and says, you've already split people up like this. Ellen, do a randomized experiment now. Say, okay, what do you mean? Randomized. So I say, well, which group could you really operate on in good conscience? I said, this group right here. This is the group I could do operate. Well, now if you want to do a randomized experiment, Dr. Fireman, I'll call myself Dr. Fire, medical Dr. Fireman, you know what you're going to have to do? These are the groups that potentially you're going to operate on. You're not going to operate on those groups. They're too sick. You're not going to do it. But what you're going to do here is for each and every person here, you're going to flip a coin and let an objective chance procedure decide who actually gets that operation and who doesn't. Who is in the treatment group and who is in the comparison group. You're not going to decide. And I said, well, wait a minute, I want to operate on all of them. No. You can't, because the only way you'll ever be able to figure out if this operation works is if you compare apples to apples, the same type. These people are all ones you'd operate on, and then if you flip a coin to divide them up into two groups, you're going to get two groups that are as alike on all characteristics that might be relevant to whether they're going to survive the operation. Their family support, their age, there are all these things we might not even know how it's going to come into play. You know, but you know there's only going to be just random differences, accidental. The only thing that's going to be different about these, if you do it this way, Dr. Fireman, the only thing that's going to be different is what? What's the only thing that's going to be different?
The people inside the experiment?
The actual treatment they get. That's the only thing that's going to be, yeah, there's going to be differences in the people, but those are all accidental random differences. Right? You're not going to be the same people. You're going to have differences. But those are random differences. Those are like flipping a coin. We can measure those with probability. You'll see how. But is there going to be any other systematic differences between the two groups? They're going to be as like as possible, and the only difference is after you divide them up, the only difference is one of them's going to get what? The surgery, and the other one's going to get placebo surgery. That would be nice. We'll talk about that later, but the other one's not going to get surgery. So do you see how everything's the same? And I might even argue, pretend it's a statistician telling me this, I'd say, Mr. Statistician, I don't think it's fair to do that. I mean, these people need the operation. I have a feeling these people could really help. How can I just let a flip of the coin decide a life or death issue? And a statistician says, well, you know, Dr. Fireman, you have no idea whether this procedure works at all. You don't. And the only way, and think about this, you have no idea, do you really want to go on for life in your practice performing this for years when you really don't know if it works or not? You have to first find out if it works before you start assigning your patients to do it. And the only way you're going to find out if it works, the only way, is by doing this experiment. You're going to get your permission from everybody. You're not going to deceive them. You're going to get permission. They'll understand. And you explain to them, this is the only way we'll ever find out. And it's for science, and it's for your health. You know, it could work, and but we'll never find out otherwise. I said, okay, I see. Otherwise, we could just go down blind alleys forever and propagate bad things. Okay, I'll do it. That's the idea. So that's what happened. And 4 people were convinced to do the randomized controls just in exactly that way. But before we do that, what was the problem here? This is back, this is the treatment group, you guys. And this is the comparison group, you guys over there and you. What were the differences, I said? The treatment group, I said, was what? Healthier, more likely to survive, sturdier. You guys, sorry, we're about to die anyways. I mean, let's face it, I'm sorry, you were frail. Frailer. I just didn't want to do this to you. Frailer, sicker. That's how a good doctor would have, you know, if I was doing the best interest of you, that's how I do it. Okay, so now we wait 3 years. These people have the operation, these don't. And we look after 3 years and we see that this group only has a 45% survival rate. And this group has a 60% survival rate. Do you see where I'm getting that from? Right here. Right here. Much higher. And that's why these are the non-randomized studies. These are the bad studies. These are the good ones. I'll just write bad and good. Do you see why they were markedly enthusiastic now? Does this make sense to you? Okay. As opposed to, the randomized studies just took this group, randomly divided into and look, no wonder they weren't enthusiastic. Would you be enthusiastic? This is the random, when they did the random assignment, there was no difference. That's why they said that it didn't work. And so we can trust this, we can trust the randomized experiments. Why? Because there were no other differences between the two groups except the surgery. We didn't put a healthier patient, a healthier population versus a sicker population. We eliminated all those differences, which are called confounders. So we trust the randomized experiments because they eliminate confounders. These are confounders, differences that arise through non-random assignment into treatment and control groups because they eliminate confounders. Okay? You take all the patients who the doctor's willing to operate on and then divide them up into 2 groups. Questions on that? So keep that visual in your head. And look, results from the surgery. It's not like these guys, the non-randomized experimenters, got any better results with their surgery. Look, they're the same. These 2 are the same. They didn't do any better with their surgery. It's just, look, they compared them to a much sicker population. Their controls were different. Sure, it looks like your surgery works if you pick a bunch of people who are going to die anyway as your controls, which is what they did. Okay? So the controls were sick. These 2 were the same, but the comparison group, the control group was going to die anyway. Control group was sicker. Okay, so that says, if you can't read that, it says, obviously this group was sicker. They were going to die. The control group and the other one was chosen from the same population. Is this, I mean, all right, so please stop me because you probably have some questions. Do you? Anybody have any questions? Anything? Do you nod if you understand basically what's going on, if it makes sense to you? Okay, and so you understand the importance of doing these randomized experiments. Now, our goal is to make the treatment and control as alike as possible. So if I really wanted to try to make it closer to our gold standard, when I was doing the randomized design and I flipped a coin to see if you should be in treatment or control, I should have treated you exactly the same. That means what? If I wheeled the operation group into the surgery room, gave them anesthesia, sliced them open with a knife, did all that stuff, I have to do the same. Should I do the same thing? Give placebo surgery to the comparison group? Give you the anesthesia, walk you into the operating, here's your operating room, slice you open, and then at the last minute say, so far it's a placebo because you're suffering all these effects, you're getting the, and at the last minute I don't do anything. Maybe just fiddle a little bit in there, but don't put the shunt in and then sew you back up. That would be placebo surgery. And to have it be, yes?
So in the randomized study, was both the surgery and the controls just the healthy people, or both the sick and the healthy?
Good question. She said in the randomized was the treatment and control group, did they include these sick people at all? Is that what you're asking? No, they did not. It was only on people that the doctors were willing to operate on. And if you think about how that applies to real life, that's the real question. You only want to, you're trying to give advice to doctors and patients who are in a position to actually have this surgery. Is it worth going through or not? So it actually is ideal there. And then to make it double blind, remember, we don't only want to make it exactly as alike. So these people are getting evaluated. Their blood pressure's taken, there's tremendous amounts of measurements that are being taken to see how healthy these people are along the way, for the 2 years that we track them. So the people who are evaluating them, well, I suppose anybody could tell whether they were dead or not, but they were going to be evaluating them along the way and giving them advice, and that group can't know who was in which group. So the doctor's not involved in that, the one who actually did the surgery. Somebody else is evaluating him, and the doctor finds out at the end of the study. So, do you think we could do that in this case? Have placebos? Yeah, go ahead. The causal business and the confounder business is what yeah, okay. So, all right. The causal, and you're referring to your homework assignments, which is next chapter, where you have to distinguish whether something's a causal factor or a confounder. We could do the same thing here very quickly because it does come up. Usually you talk about it in observational studies, but there's no reason you can't talk about it in non-random studies. So if we wanted to draw a little diagram here, if you have a non-random study, in non-random studies, in observational studies, his question is, clarify this confounder business. I will later, but I'll just do it in this context because maybe it'll make it. So just take out another sheet of paper and just write, in non-random experiments and in observational studies, because they're necessarily non-random, anything that's not randomized. Just write, any study that's not randomized, any study that's not randomized, you're going to get confounders. Any study that's not randomized, you have possible confounders. Okay, what does this even mean? What does this even mean? In this case, okay, so he wants us to think about it in this case. Okay, you have possible confounders. Let's go through first. Okay, so here you have maybe you don't know what a confounder is. So the question is, does what? This operation, I'll say, does this operation lower the mortality rate, cure the people, lower the mortality, raise the survival? Do you like raise survival better? Maybe it's less confusing. Raise survival rates. We'll write that, raise survival rates. Does it? That's the question. Does the operation work? Does this operation work? How it works is a causal factor. And they knew how it worked. They said it was going to redirect the flow of blood and do all this stuff, and it was going to help. That was their plan. That was the causal factor. It was going to redirect the flow of blood. It made sense. So people wouldn't redirect the flow of blood. That sounds funny. I meant blood. Redirect the flow of blood. It sounds good. Flow of blood. What is blow? Okay. Okay. Is that even possible? Redirect the flow of blow? Okay. So that's the causal factor. Redirect the flow of blood. And we don't even call it a causal factor. We call it a causal link. It's not really another factor at all. It's just explaining how the operation would work. Do you understand that? You want your doctors to have some explanation. How's this operation going to work? You tell me how. Explain how putting a shunt in is going to cause me to live longer. You tell me. And then the doctor will say, oh, because when I put this shunt in, it will redirect your flow of blood. And the operation, the shunt, will do such and such. That is how the operation causes lower mortality. And if we had a randomized study and it worked, we'd have to figure that out. We know now that operations lead to lower mortality because there's nothing else different about the two groups. We better be able to figure out how it does that so we can perfect it, so we can make sure. We have to understand that mechanism. It's a causal link, it's a causal mechanism that's saying that our treatment, this is our treatment, that our treatment causes this response. Yes, that's what the studies all want to show. But in these type of experiments, in non-randomized experiments, since there are, let me just go out a little bit, in non-randomized experiments, since there's other differences between these groups and this one, besides other differences, I chose you because you had other differences. I said, I'm choosing you because you're healthy. I'm choosing you because you're frailer. That could be mixed up. That could be the true cause of why there's a higher survival rate. Maybe the shunt has nothing to do with it. So in non-randomized experiments, there can be something, it might not be this at all, it might be something else. Mystery, and this is why I'm saying it's like a mystery. It's something else, who knows what? It's a lurking variable. That makes it sound more like a mystery. People call it that, or a confounder. Man, think of it as a lurking variable, something else that's really causing the lower mortality, that's really raising the survival rates, that's really causing the lower mortality. This is what's making people live longer. Higher survival rates. Higher survival rates. Okay? It's a mystery box. Well, there could be lots of things that are causing higher survival rate, maybe, but it also has to be something. We saw this difference. I operated on these people. And the ones I operated on had higher survival rates. So this mystery box, whatever it is, also has to be connected, has to be linked to the treatment, has to be linked to the operation. So how do you figure out this is a confounder? It's a a different, it's not explaining how the operation might not even cause this. This might be bogus. It's the true. So, how do you find the confounders? How would you look for those? How would you look for confounders? Here, what would you do? Well, they're only going to happen, they're never going to happen if I randomize, because there aren't going to be any. There aren't going to be any differences between you guys, except for the treatment. But if I don't randomize, how do you look for confounders? When you don't randomize, think about it. Think about, okay, what's different about these? I didn't randomize. What's different about the people at the edges of the here and you guys? So think about it. Here's the people who have the operation, who I assigned to the operation. So here's the people who have operation. This is the treatment group. That you guys are going to get the operation. And these people are not going to get the operation. Okay, don't have the operation. Now I just want you to brainstorm here and think about, okay, you're going to be different. I chose you to be different. Could any of these differences, there's going to be different, actually be the reason for the lower mortality? That would be a confounder. So what differences did I say there were? I said the people who have the operation are what? Healthier. Stronger. They might even be younger, for all I know. Probably would be. And these are going to be frailer. Sicker. Older. You know what I'm saying? Any one of these could fit. Do you see how these could be confounders? Because it might not be the operation at all. It might be one of these other differences that's leading to lower mortality. Does that make sense to people? Does that answer your question over there, whoever asked it? Did it? Who asked the question? Does that help at all? Okay, so these are the confounders. Now, it gets very complicated with the diet article, and something can be both a confounder and a causal link. But you have to understand how, if they start off healthier and stronger and everything, and you give them the operation, and they also have a lower mortality rate, how do you know? You can't tell if it's the operation. The operation might be helping too, but you can't tell. Does that help you? So randomize. When you randomize, this whole thing's eliminated. Why is the whole thing eliminated? Because now if I tried to list characteristics between the operation group, we'll do the same thing. This is in the randomized. You don't have to write this down, just think about it. In the randomized experiment, you got the operation, the people who got the operation, and the people who didn't get it. People who didn't get operation. Okay, we got these. Now you try to list try to list some differences. Try to list some differences. Are there any systematic differences? No. I randomly assigned you, so why would you be any different? You could have some accidental differences, a few more old people here, a few more. Yeah, we're going to measure that later when we do a statistical significance test. But are there any, we randomized. So how can there be any? No, these are the same. These are equal. Same on everything except for what? Within accidental differences, within same on everything within random variation, on everything except one giant exception, except what? This group is going to get what? The treatment. Except for the actual treatment. That way, if you measure, if these people end up having a higher survival rate than those, they didn't, but let's say they did, they had a higher survival rate, and you go back and you think, could it have been anything else? There isn't anything else there. It has to be the operation. Does that help? Do y'all get it? Or am I beating a dead horse? Raise your hand if I'm beating a dead horse. Oh, that poor horse. There are a few people that think that. Raise your hand if this has actually helped you. Okay. All right. Now, and that you're going to see some cases where it's going to help even the ones who think they understand it now. Okay, so let's move on. All right. So no placebo surgery. That's kind of crazy, right? Can't have placebo surgery. Turn the page. Whoa, example 3, placebo surgery. What? For real? Yes. Top of page 8, placebo surgery. Yeah? Okay, so people think, oh, something like surgery, placebos aren't going to have any difference. But they had a dramatic difference in the one they've done since. They've done some other ones since, and they seem to have quite a dramatic effect. So this was one on arthroscopic knee surgery. It was back in, when was it started this? You can read about this. This is the first one that was done. And it was inspired by the coach of the Houston Rockets who had Kobe Bryant on his team. And he was about to face knee surgery for a lot of athletes. Probably a lot of you guys in this class had to have this arthroscopic knee surgery. And the question was, his coach, I can't remember who he was at the time, said, there's 2 procedures here. One, they go in with this instrument called an arthroscope. And they put in, anybody here have it? Raise your hand if you've ever had this. Okay, so do you have 3 little holes in your knee? Okay, so you can describe better. What do they do?
Mine was but they had to pull a little part of my knee had broken off and pull chunks out. So they basically take 3 little cuts they put in the knee and they put like a
What he said is they had to, I'm going to make it a little bit more general. But in general, what they do is they wanted to scrape a little bit of the cartilage, usually is what they do off your knee, and remove some of that because they think it's irritating thing. So they take this arthroscope, he says it's 3 tubes, they go in, they make 3 little cuts in your knee. Not very invasive, right? At all. And that was one procedure they do. They cut away the cartilage. And another one was I'm not sure if you had this as well, but they go in and it's called lavage. They also wash away the cartilage. And they didn't know which one was going to work better for these athletes. And the coach wanted to know because it's so common. So he went to this one surgeon and she said, you know, coach, I think that's a really good idea. We never know unless we really randomly assign people. Would you agree with that? Would you? He said, yeah, that would be good. And he said, but she said, you know what? I think I'm going to add a 3rd arm to this study, a 3rd group, placebo surgery, because you know what? I am not convinced that this procedure does any good at all. I'm really not. So it was kind of an extraordinary idea, and then they decided I don't think the athletes wanted to volunteer for it, and so they decided to move it to the whole study over to the Veterans Hospital, where the veterans were going to get extremely good care, and they were going to get all this extra services, so they had some motivation to actually participate in the study. And they weren't so much athletes, they were more middle-aged guys who, it was a similar type of thing, but they were suffering from arthritis of the knee. So very similar. So they moved that whole experiment over to the Veterans Hospital, and they had these, and they did it. They did it. It was really cool. You can read about it. They even went so far as to simulate the conditions of, they had this soundtrack playing in the background that made noises of flushing and scraping for all. They played the same soundtrack for everybody. These patients volunteered. They had no idea what group they were in. They woke up with the 3 cuts. Everybody woke up with the 3 cuts, the same level of anesthesia, which was a very mild form, so it wasn't dangerous. Everything was the same. The doctor himself didn't even know, or the nurses, until he opened up the code right before the operation. They had the same exact setup. The nurses, nobody knew until they opened up. And then, of course, the people who evaluated them had no clue which of the three groups they were in. They followed these patients for I think it was 3 years, at least 2 years. They followed them, and okay. And they didn't know which group they were in. So what happened? Well, most of the patients in all three arms, let's just consider the ones who actually got treatment and the ones who got nothing, though here, said their knee pain had improved. It had quite high subjective satisfaction. Like, did you think did you think you improved? Yeah, most people like it. It's positive, but what was interesting was there was no difference in patient satisfaction between the placebo group and the not placebo group. And more importantly, none of the groups improved any at all, or very, very little. And there was no differences between them on any objective measure of knee flexibility, knee strength. They did all these, there was no differences between the two groups. So of course, when the Veterans Hospital and Medicare, which was funding this, got these results and they're spending millions and millions of dollars, they just quit funding it in a heartbeat. They said, it doesn't work. And I thought, well, wait a minute, it does work. Patients are happier. But they said, yeah, we're not going to spend all that money just to have, just give them a placebo and some other cheaper placebo, not an operation placebo. But those of you who've had it, I don't want you to think, oh, it was just for nothing, because it actually hasn't been extrapolated to athletic injuries, and it might work there. All right, so that was sort of interesting. And then finally, before, we're going to get to chapter 2, I know. I just want to say this, this hormone replacement, I just want to say something about it. I know most of you are not interested in menopause or anticipating it at this point. It's probably not a burning topic for you, but this is all about menopause. I just see people just sort of going, ugh. Get the visual out, I don't want to think about that. But it's important because it really shaped public opinion about how to conduct surveys. It really did. I mean, just thinking about it now, I told you 10 years ago when I first started teaching, this is the absolute truth. I had to argue with students, first day of class, second day of class, third day of class, why randomization could be better than deliberately matching people up. They thought that was a ludicrous idea. They said, wait a minute, in any other aspect of my life, I don't randomly decide. Why do you want me to randomly decide? It was just extremely hard stretch for them to think why. They wanted to act in the best interest of the patients, in the best interest, they wanted to choose. And it took me a long time to get to the point where you guys waltzed into class first day. I asked you, how would you like to, think about brainstorming about how to design an ideal experiment? And it's almost like, why is she even talking about this randomization? I'll vote for it. And that's due to this experiment. That's due to this experiment. Because back here, I'll just tell you, the turning point was right here. This was a landmark experiment that turned people's heads around completely, and particularly in the popular press. So at least 6 million, up until this, so at least, let's read about it. At least 6 million women in this country had been taking hormone replacement therapy for years on the basis of numerous studies, none of them non-randomized, which showed that women, when given estrogen after menopause, the idea was, okay, after menopause, everything bad happens to you, right? You fall apart, your skin gets bad, you start getting heart attacks, you have no sexual interest, you're just, menopause, it's a bad word. And so women said, they said, what happens with menopause? Well, your estrogen levels go down. So the idea was, why not just give artificial estrogen? We can be young forever. We can have a lower incidence, our bones will stay strong, because before that, women's bones were much stronger than men, they had fewer heart attacks before they had, once you hit menopause, you get the same kind of heart disease men get, and your skin starts sagging, you lose interest in sex, all sorts of bad things. You've heard the stories, right? So they thought, okay, just give them some estrogen. And that's what they did for years and years, and it seemed to work. Millions of women were doing this. All right. And they had a lower incidence of heart disease, stroke, colon cancer, bone fracture. Not to mention there were so many advertising advertisements showing how your skin would improve and how much you'd enjoy your sex life. But none of the studies, serious, none of the studies use randomized controls, okay? Then, a study sponsored by the NIH enrolled 16,608 healthy women from ages 50 to 79 and randomly assigned them to take either the HRT or a placebo. Randomly. And it was actually partially, it was at the urging of the Wyeth Drug Company, which was the biggest supplier of the HRT treatment. They were so sure they were going to find even more glorious results for their forever young drug. Okay. And then, much to everyone's surprise, myself included, the study was prematurely stopped in the summer of 2002. Why? Because it showed that the risks outweighed the benefits, that while it did lower the risk of hip fractures, it actually increased the risk of heart disease, heart attacks, stroke, and most of all, breast cancer. It really did. So it had to be stopped. If you are conducting a study and you see the risks are outweighing the benefits, you morally have to stop it. And they didn't expect to stop it, and it was news everywhere. And since so many of the reporters are in this age group, or their wives are, it just was everywhere in the press saying the new gold standard for experimental design is randomization. Okay? So if you look at this, what was the problem? And we really have to get to chapter 2, but just think, what are some of the possible reasons why the non-randomized? Remember, there's going to be differences. Randomized studies, the treatment and control group are going to be chosen from the same population. The only difference will be the HRT. It didn't work here. Here, what happened? If you think back on it, you think about, all right, what was going on here? The doctors were choosing in the best interests of their patients, and the patients themselves were choosing. People like me, I was probably going to go on it. Doctors and patients together were working out the best plan. I mean, that's what I'd go in, and we even discussed it with my doctor. And I remember the words my doctor used. It's like, okay, you're already, exercising. You already have low blood pressure. You're doing everything right. You're going to face this menopause, and we want to keep you, you're eating really well, and you're doing all this stuff. And I recommend that you go on this. Because right now we just tested your bones, they're really strong. This was before they were going to put me on it. And this will ensure they stay strong. This will ensure your blood pressure stays low. This will ensure that you're not going to be at a high risk for heart disease. And then he says, and plus it will keep you looking young. And said even something about sex I didn't want to hear. Okay, so I don't like my doctors like saying, sort of asking me about that. I don't know, when I don't bring it up. So he says, and you'll have a better sex life or something. Okay. I'm not kidding. They were saying this. They said it'll keep you all juicy down there is basically what they said. And do you want your doctors really saying that to you? All right. I didn't mean to say that. I'm not going to put it in the notes. All right. But basically everything's going to be moister, he said, and then, all right. Now, these conversations. And then the controls will be sicker. The doctor's not even going to bring it up. If a woman comes in, she's like smoking already, eating all fried foods, it's like, tremendously high blood pressure, obese. There's so many things that he has to tell her that are so much more important than this HRT. He has to get her on track to really take care of herself. Those seem overwhelmingly. Why would you add one more little thing into the mix? Where she's got the high blood pressure already. Any new drug could introduce complications. Let's work on just getting her maybe to quit smoking first. The basics. And That would make an enormous amount of difference, way more than this little edge she's going to get from HRT. So they were much sicker. And anyway, if they had a medical condition. So this is, and of course, they saw tremendous, you know, the women, yeah, who are on this, yeah, they got less heart disease. But when they actually did the randomized trial and just took the women like me, the healthier women, and randomly assigned them to the two groups, the effect was reversed. It was worse for you. These women were getting more breast cancer. And actually, I know 3 of my friends, I know this is anecdotal, but they swear they blame it because of that, because they got breast, actually more than 3, took it and they got the type of breast cancer that's very sensitive to estrogen, that has estrogen receptors. And so it's a dangerous thing to do this, is what I'm saying. You can't, even though the evidence is overwhelming, you always have to check yourself. Always. And say, especially in life and death medical issues, and say, wait a sec, can I turn it around into a randomized experiment? And if I can't, then what am I going to do? I'm going to have to think what the confounders are and deal with them and think about, is it the confounder or not? And that's what we're doing in the next page. So this is just summary. Let's skip to chapter. Okay. Now, this is good because you're hearing this over and over and over again. This is good. Observational study. Researcher has, where's my highlighter? I just went and bought some. Researcher has no power, no control. I hate that use of the word control because it's used so many different ways, but we're going to say has no power over assignment into the treatment group. He has no power, and our language, this should be into treatment and comparison group. That's all we mean. The researcher in a controlled experiment, this is an observational study with comparison group, with controls. I told you I hated this last time. I said somebody brought the controlled experiment. That means the experimenter chooses. An observational study, they don't choose. So we're using control to mean choose, and then we're using it again to mean comparison, to completely different meanings. And then we're going to use it a third time to adjust for, we're going to use the word control, for the confounder. So there it is. No wonder people get confused in statistics. 3 entirely different meanings of the same word. So, observational study, the researcher has no power. He doesn't choose. And here, the experimenter chooses. That's what this means. Chooses. The researcher decides how to divide the subjects into a treatment and a comparison group. All right. The subjects may be randomly assigned or not randomly assigned. This is always non-random. These are always non-random studies because it's not that the experimenter is deciding, but the subjects themselves. They're not deciding randomly. They're not flipping coins on themselves, maybe haphazardly, but not randomly, the way we know it means. Or fate or circumstances determines if the treatment just happened to be born a woman, and you want to happen to be born a certain race, and you want to study how that affects your life later on. You know, if there's some kind of discrimination, or you happen to be born firstborn or something. The researcher observes and compares. Okay. Now, they both have control groups. We know that. They both have comparison groups. They both use comparisons, or should. The key difference is how the subjects got there in the first place. If the researcher assigned them as a controlled experiment. If it's not, it's an observational study. That's all you have to think about it. And then, of course, some studies have to be observational. Anything that's harmful, because a researcher is morally you just can't assign people to do things that you already know are harmful, like smoking, drinking, taking some drugs, and stuff like that. Starving them. Okay. They have to be observational. I mean, there have been cruel societies like the Nazis that have actually done these experiments, but we hope that never happens again. All right. Some studies have to be observational. Actually, our society did some terrible experiments on prisoners that were of this variety. Not treating people who had syphilis to see and saw what happened with them, for example. So some studies have to be observational, and then others just circumstance. Like you might want to study, as we said before, the effects of being an only child compared to having a big family. That's just something, general circumstances happen to you, etc. You might want to the effects of living in a crowded city as opposed to a more spacious country setting. Tons of things. Now, observational studies are done out of necessity. Whenever possible, you should always think, hey, can I turn it into a controlled experiment? Maybe, maybe not. All right. The main problem of observational studies is they can't really show causation, because the treatment and control group are going to be different than each other. People who choose to smoke are going to be different in other ways. They're probably not going to have as healthy eating habits. They're probably going to drink more. How do you know if it's the smoking that caused something and not one of those other differences, right? It confuses things. Did the treatment cause the response? Or is there some other third factor that's causing both of those, making it look like it? So what we do to statisticians adjust for these confounding factors by breaking the population down into subgroups where the confounding factor is all the same. So let's just look at, go to the next page, and go through this example. I think you understand. How many people have read this example and understand it already? I'm asking you, do you want me to go through this with the same exact reasoning, with your, almost the same thing with your reading diet articles instead of doing this right now? Do you think that would be helpful? Raise your hand if you'd prefer that. Want me to stick with this? You got to vote. Stick with this, raise your hand. Diet articles, raise your hand. Okay, we'll stick with this. Okay, so here's an extreme example that will help you remember what a confounder is. And I know I only have 5 minutes left, but I'm going to go 5. I'll let you out 1 minute beforehand. So 4 more, okay? Okay. So, suppose people thought, you saw this, people who carry lighters, this is data you took, actually get more lung cancer. So the question is, do lighters actually cause lung cancer? If so, you have to think of how. How? The answer to that question, what's the causal mechanism, the causation? How do you get from here to there? That's called a causal link, something that would fill in there. But since the people chose themselves, since people divided themselves up into 2 groups, I didn't randomly assign them, there might be something else about those people. Lighters, if not, why would people who carry lighters get more lung cancer? There's a mystery there. What is different about those people who carry lighters and those that don't that could fit right in that box? Some difference. What do you think it could be? Cigarettes. Why? Because people who carry lighters are going to be more likely to carry cigarettes. So that would be a confounder. That's a confounder. Okay. Now, let's look at these. Well, maybe there's something people would say, well, I think there's another cause of lung cancer that's making us see what we're trying to figure out, why we're seeing this link here. And so people all the time say, oh, well, what about genetics or something like that? Some people are just more prone to lung cancer. Yeah, that's true. But unless those same genes cause you to carry lighters, why would we see this connection? We're trying to explain why people with lighters have more lung cancer. Do you think it would be the same gene that causes people to have more lung cancer would also cause them to carry lighters? No. So that has nothing to do with it. There are plenty of other causes of lung cancer, but we're trying to explain this mystery. We see this connection here. So let's look at the next one. Age. Lung cancer rises with age. Well, that's true. So do you think that older people then are carrying lighters and younger people aren't? Does that even seem right? No, it's another one of these nothings. It has nothing to do with explaining that connection. How about smoking cigarettes? People who smoke cigarettes have a higher rate of lung cancer. Yes, it has to connect to that. And are also more likely to carry lighters. Yes. So that is a confounder. Maybe we could get rid of the lighters. Maybe it has nothing to do. The lighters, this arrow, or you could put it here, could be completely broken. It has nothing to do. Get rid of these. The lighters are just a marker for people who carry cigarettes. They have nothing to do with lung cancer. That's one possibility. Lighter fluid. Perhaps inhaling the fumes could cause lung damage. Well, if you talk about that, you'd think about, maybe lighters do cause lung cancer. Let's say we really believed it. We'd have to explain how, and this fits right in here. Do you see how that's the causal link? This lighter fluid fits in that box. Does that make sense to people? And the last one, radon. Radon exposure raises one's risk of lung cancer. That's absolutely true. And you have to think, okay, is that explaining it? Do people who live in radon areas, are they more likely to carry lighters? Does it have anything to do with lighters? Does it? So it's neither. And so that's what you have to go through, that type of thinking. Oh, wait a minute, not over till it's over. And here's one very important announcement. Yeah, no packing up. We have a minute. I have decided to extend the homework that's due Wednesday night to Friday night because we really didn't finish enough. And the lecture's over, and thank you so much for your participation. I really, really liked it.